President-elect Trump's target of the moment this past week was Indiana union leader Chuck Jones. The pair duked it out on television and Twitter after Jones called out Trump for exaggerating how many jobs his deal with the carrier company had saved. Mr. Jones is just the latest example of how the president-elect handles citizens who openly challenge him. He's also launched similar attacks against the media over unflattering reports. NPR media correspondent David Folkenflik is here, and he joins us now to talk about this. All right, David, I want to get your take on this. What do you think, what do you make of the soon-to-be most powerful man in the world going after a union guy, a blue-collar worker? And I get that he's a leader, a union leader, and that can make for political adversaries. But is this something that is sustainable for the president-elect?
Well, he's not only a union leader, he's a local union leader. And it turns out he's a local union leader whose family has received essentially death threats and threats of violence by phone as a, let's not say necessarily in direct consequence of these tweets, but it seemingly sure followed them. And that's very disturbing. That is, think about the phrase, the bully pulpit.
Right.
You know, we think about the pulpit part of it. We don't want to think so much about the bully part of it. But essentially what you've got there is an extraordinary megaphone by dint of the fact that social media allows him to publish instantaneously and broadly, but also that it's amplified by virtue of who he is. I think you've got to say, you know, the man is having a transition that is not utterly disparate from how he campaigned.
Right.
And we should not be utterly surprised by this, although I had thought that until this moment, he had settled down a little bit, that it was a little bit less vituperation on the tweets. But what we're seeing here is rhetoric consistent with how Mr. Trump reacts in the face of public criticism.
It's ironic, is it not, that Melania Trump, his wife, in her speech right before the election said that one of the things she wanted to focus on, were she to be the first lady, is on cyberbullying. Meanwhile, the head of the AFL-CIO of Indiana came on our show, and he said what he thinks that the president-elect is doing is cyberbullying, which is essentially bullying somebody on the internet. And he's got, 12 million followers when you combine all of his social media accounts at once, and that's a very, very large megaphone.
Well, one of the things Trump has said consistently is, don't take me too literally, folks. You know, there's a disconnect between what I might say in the moment, what I might actually feel. But I actually think he is in the moment. That's what he feels. It's just he might feel something very different 12 hours later. When folks in the media, when Joe Scarborough is critical of him, he'll trash the show, talk about his personal life. When Joe Scarborough is flattering, he talks about his friend Joe. You know, he really veers as though there's no conflict or contradiction. He doesn't register hypocrisy when it emanates from him. And he also, I got to be honest, shame is not a familiar part of his emotional makeup, which is why it's so hard to hold Trump accountable, at least as a candidate, and in the ensuing weeks since his election, to the false statements that he makes. He's not one to apologize. He doesn't believe in it. He's not one to correct himself. He doesn't think it's necessary.
I want to ask you about that, but before we move on, this idea of going after individual Americans and not political adversaries, he got into it with the Gold Star family, the family of Khizr Khan. That seemed to turn off a lot of people. Is there a risk for him that it may turn off some of his own supporters the more he goes after individuals, as opposed to political opponents, which nobody would disagree with? He has the right to do.
Look, I think that he certainly seems to go more smoothly and be taken more seriously the more he retreats from 140 text slashing at various people who are not in the political fray. There was a piece in the Washington Post about a young woman whom he attacked after she asked a question over a year ago at St. Anselm College in New Hampshire, and that's the sort of thing you just don't want to see from a president, just as a citizen, as a parent, right? At the same time, there was that famous tape where he was caught on audio from Access Hollywood, where he talked about grabbing a woman by the genitalia and saying, I can get away with it because I'm a celebrity. Well, all kinds of right-thinking figures in the media and feminist leaders said, well, this is a step too far. But it turns out, it would appear that Donald Trump was right. He could get away with it because he was a celebrity. That is, he could at minimum overcome that.
Right.
I don't think anybody is advocating this. I don't think he even is advocating this. That was one of the rare instances in which he did offer a kind of apology. But nonetheless, I think that his aides are signaling to your colleagues, my colleagues, and others that Trump, in a sense, is going to be Trump as president, and he's going to do things he wants them to do. What he wants to do, even if some of them had advised, you're going to do even better if you step away from this.
What do you think, David, and this is something you talked about a little earlier, when it comes to some of the things that he says, for example, millions of people, that voted illegally, those kinds of claims that no one can find factual evidence of. What is the responsibility of journalists that are going to be covering the Trump administration and specifically the president-elect, soon-to-be president of the United States? Has the mandate, or will the mandate for journalists covering the Trump administration change or morph into something, or will it remain what it has remained for the past, 100 years in our republic?
Look, I think journalists should be completely open to the possibility that this turns out to be a very conventional administration in White House. That does not seem to be the case from any of the signals we're sending, not in terms of the political stances. There doesn't seem to be any mitigation of sort of where they fall on the spectrum, but also particularly in terms of the tenor. This is not a candidate or a campaign or seemingly a transition that has embraced the ideas of transparency or accountability, the role that the press plays on the behalf of the public, helping to educate them what the heck the government's doing in their name, right?
Although Barack Obama was criticized by the press and by many others, including the opposition, the Republicans, for being one of the least transparent presidents in American history. But what is the distinction between President Obama not giving a lot of press conferences and not being transparent about the activities and some of the things that he's doing versus the transparency question when it comes to Donald Trump? There's got to be a...
Well, so look, I think there are a couple things going on. One of which was, I think Obama did have a lot of issues in terms of transparency and in terms of his control of information. It wasn't a leaky ship. That was one of the things he liked about George W. Bush's administration. He modeled on that. On the other hand, I think the problem for Obama was the incredible yawning chasm between how he promised to be the most transparent administration in history and what he actually did.
Right.
I don't think he was the least. I think that his promises far outstripped what he was willing to deliver. In terms of Donald Trump, I think that the press is more like a moment as it was during, let's say, the financial crisis or after 9/11. This is a real change. We don't understand all the implications. The political movement and alignment that helped propel Donald Trump into the White House is not 100% fully understood. And I think that the way he's going to govern is unclear because he's never run for public office before. He's never held public office before. We have no record against which to hold him accountable. So in this moment, I think the press isn't going to treat him unfairly, but I think it has to be much more aerobic, pay much more attention to his rules, his appointments, the policies, the legislation, the executive orders, the treaties, those that he embraces, those that he abrogates or drops, and sees what the effects are going to be for hundreds of millions of Americans. And on a separate sort of split track or parallel track, pay attention to his rhetoric, pay attention to what he does in person and online, because that is important too, but that's not the only thing going on. There are a lot of things happening in Washington that will far outstrip that.
At the end, and the final question, I guess, is, the press has always sort of patted themselves on the back when it comes to doing the business of journalism, and the craft and the being a journalist is something that people take very, very seriously. And the reason I said 100 years, even though the Republic is older, is because there was a shift. I mean, we're not talking about the yellow journalism of the 19th century. There started to be a shift in the 20th century. And yet, there were many reporters who knew that President Kennedy was very, very sick and chose not to report that. There were reporters who apparently knew that he was conducting affairs in the White House and chose not to report that. The press was also derelict, a lot of people feel, in the run-up to the invasion in Iraq. And that's after years of saying to ourselves, well, we'll never get fooled again. We'll never be reporters like we were during the Kennedy administration. So I guess the question is, what do you think will happen now going forward? Are reporters going to be even more aggressive? Are they going to sit back and wait to make sure that they don't get death threats the way, individuals are getting? I mean, where does it go from here?
Well, I think it's a question of the degree to which individual journalists and their news organizations are willing to embrace the challenge in front of them. I think, an editor of mine told me years ago in Washington, he's like, listen, journalists can tell which way the wind is blowing as well as anyone. They can watch the polls as closely as anyone, and they can shift with public sentiment. You found journalists giving often Ronald Reagan fairly positive coverage as his polls were strong, more critical coverage as his polls went down.
Yeah,
That's the way the game gets played. That's the way a game can get played in the Trump administration. I think there's a different challenge. People compare Trump to Ronald Reagan, a celebrity, a Hollywood star. Ronald Reagan had twice been governor, an elected governor of one of the most populous states in the country. That is a record you can see him in public life. This is different. I think that we really have to, as journalists, embrace this challenge. It may end up being a very conventional administration, but I think keeping the attention of reporters on what the administration does as opposed to what it says is doing has always been important. no more so than now.
All right, David Folkenflik, always great to have you on. Thank you so much for your insights.
You bet.
Yeah, great.